This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by Surfshark VPN. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Wednesday, February 26, 2020, and my guest is Ray Wong of Input. Hi, Ray. How are you?
How's it going? I'm good.
I'm great too. So I hear that you have a Galaxy S20 Ultra in your pocket right now.
I do. I've been testing it since last Thursday, shooting a lot of photos, really putting it through its paces, and yeah, it's been an interesting experience for sure.
Are you excited? That's a loaded question, I know.
It is a loaded question. I mean, this is Samsung's best. It's Samsung's most expensive flagship phone. It's their most powerful. And, they, as always, packed it with as much new technology as possible. And, there's just so much to dive into, but mainly the cameras, right? There are a ton of cameras on the front, on the rear. And they really went all out this time, at least on paper. And so, yeah, I mean, let's really talk about it, because I'm a big mobile photography guy.
I'm gonna rely on you because Samsung still hasn't sent me a review in it. As second tier folks, we just gotta wait. But I've played with one obviously at the event in San Francisco, and so I didn't take too many photos with it. But I get a bit of a feel for things in terms of specs. So, what's your general feeling about this camera system before we get into maybe recapping what's where, because, it's pretty unique. How do you feel in general? Are you happy? Are you concerned? I saw you had some issues with autofocus, and there's also been an update since then, since I sent you the topics yesterday. I don't know if you had a chance to try that out. I mean, etc.
I was initially very, very excited. Big specs, right? 108 megapixel main sensor, 64 megapixel telephoto lens or foldable lens or periscope zoom lens, as they call it, with up to 100x digital zoom, which is insane.
Well, we know that's crazy. Like, that's crazy talk.
It's crazy. It's bonkers. It's like a lot of point and shoots don't even have 100x. But yeah, I mean, also an ultra wide, you get your depth sensor or time of flight, as they call it. And so you get 4 cameras on the back, and then you get this also 40 megapixel selfie camera on the front. And it's just like Samsung gunning right for Huawei. There's no doubt about it. Huawei's been doing these big sensors and, these periscope lenses with crazy zooms for years. And now Samsung's like, screw it. We're going to go out and gun right for them. And I thought, also 8K video recording, right? I thought, oh man, this is it. Samsung's really done it. Start of a new decade, 2020. They're hitting reboot a little bit. They got a new, head of mobile, DJ Ko's out, and they got a new guy in. And so I thought maybe this is it. They're going to crush Apple into the ground, really put the iPhone 11 Pro in its place. And then I got the phone and start shooting with it. And if you guys know me, I've been doing this for years, many, many years, way back, and just doing these crazy camera comparisons, before these YouTubers and influencers start doing these big camera comparisons. And I like to shoot with the kind of most realistic settings, right? So I'm not using tripods or any kind of rigs or anything, because that's just not how people are out there shooting, right? I've got my little chest pack. I've got 4, 5, 6 phones, and boom, I'm just taking them out. All the cameras are loaded and ready to go, and I'm shooting really quickly because light changes, and I try to be as consistent as possible. You want to try to be
as consistent, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly, and I think that's the most realistic shooting scenario. I'm not using any pro modes. I'm not doing any kind of manual shooting. We're going right for the out of the box experience. So testing the autofocus, we're seeing how fast it is and how it performs in real conditions where there's lots of, chaotic things potentially happening, lots of moving cars, people, things. And so, I took the phone out. Me and Evan Rogers, our guides editor, he's a big photo nerd. And we take it out for a whole day, and we're shooting all over Manhattan, really giving it the treatment. We're going all the most touristy locations you can go to.
Yeah, I saw.
Grand Central, New York Public Library, Highline, Times Square, Brooklyn Bridge, Park, Dumbo, everywhere.
It's fun being a tourist in your own town, right? I do that in SF sometimes too.
It's great. and I do it like multiple times a year. And, you go around. These are the places people are going to be shooting with their phones, right? And so we go there and we take all kinds of photos, outdoors, indoors, close-ups, foods, shots, selfies, low lights, nighttime shots, every type of shot imaginable, and then video as well. And the one thing we just noticed is that the autofocus is unfortunately not
laggy as F. I
not
was
up
amazed.
to par.
I want to tell the audience really quickly. There will be a link in the show notes here on your story on Input about the camera, your camera experience. I think it was very detailed and very in depth. I love that you had a food section. Like you actually went through all the sections. I've been reviewing cameras on phones since 2005. Like I started my photography, fascination or hobby, as it were, with phones. Like I graduated to real cameras from phones. So I'm like you. It's really close to my heart.
Right.
And I'm gonna put a link because I loved how in-depth you were, but it's very obvious to me immediately, like just watching those video samples, where you're holding up the keys in front of the camera. Like I couldn't believe how slow the focus was on that.
So I mean,
I wonder if they fixed it, because that seems like a bug to me. That does, even if I understand what, the difference in autofocus versus the previous gen.
Right.
But I still feel like that's way too slow.
So let's unpack that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So the new sensor, it's got a 108 megapixel sensor, and Samsung decided to go, instead of with their dual pixel autofocus,
which was incredible. Which think
was incredible,
when it
right?
came out on the S8, it was the fastest autofocus I'd never ever seen on a phone.
And so now they've switched over to this phase detection autofocus. And so, there's some differences between the two autofocus systems, right? Dual pixel is just, for those who don't know, that is an autofocus per pixel. Every pixel on the sensor is embedded with a focusing module, right?
Yeah, and I think Apple does this too now, right?
Right. And so you're covering a larger space, the whole sensor, and so you get this fast, almost instantaneous autofocusing.
Yeah, basically it's a parallax on each pixel. You split the pixel in half vertically, and then you get one half and the other half. You still get all your light for the shot,
right?
But now you have two areas that can be compared, and you can use that to focus on whatever,
right?
Millions of pixels.
Now the sensor on the autofocus system on the S20 Ultra, it uses phase detection autofocus, and that means only a percentage of the pixels on the sensor can focus immediately, right?
Yeah.
And so therefore you're getting slower autofocus. So the reason why I saw so much of this like hunting, where the camera is like constantly trying to keep focus, right, and lock focus, especially in video, is because it's just not as fast as dual pixel, right? And so, I mean, there are a couple of reasons maybe why Samsung went with this, and there's apparently an update that just got pushed out in South Korea, nothing for the US just yet. And again, while at the time that we're recording this, we're still maybe like a week and a half away from an official launch, right? The proper launch.
Absolutely.
So there's still time for Samsung to patch things up, but the update doesn't specify, at least the update that's being pushed out, what, there's rumors that it says it's auto flash and then a big camera update, but it doesn't say anything specifically about the autofocus. Now, there are two reasons why I think maybe Samsung decided not to go with the dual pixel autofocus.
I have some theories too.
One is they'd have to embed the focusing into every pixel, and you were talking about like 12 million pixels all the way up to 108 million pixels.
And
we're
the processing power associated with that.
Right. So that's a costly thing. We're talking about an exponential jump in the amount of pixels that would be embedded with this, focusing. And then also, so that, there's cost. And then the other thing is just the sensor is new and they haven't properly tuned it to work with this system just yet.
You touched on something that does worry me a lot, is that the sensor is new. And that's the thing about, rewinding a little bit about what you said earlier, the Samsung Apple battle. To me, there's a third player that I wish you'd included in your comparison, which is Huawei. Because, of course, the phones are unattainable. They're not really realistic to be purchased by most Americans, right? So I get all that. But I feel
I tried. I really tried. I would have
put the P30 in there because, it has a periscope lens, etc.
Sure.
But my point is that I think the thing about the reason I've always felt Samsung's phone are pretty decent at imaging, but they are never the best at imaging. And I wasn't expecting the S20 Ultra to be the best at imaging. And the reason for that is just, I feel like, the crown seems to jump around. Right now, I feel like it's Apple, of course, with the 11 this year, but, Pixel in the past, we've seen Huawei as well. But the problem that Huawei has usually is tuning. Especially color science tuning. Like, they have Leica on board, and I think for some things their color science is dead on, but consistency between shots and between lenses and between scenes is not their forte.
Right. But that's just a problem across Android as a whole, right? And that's
in general, yeah.
That's where Apple really crushes
that.
it.
I mean, it's insane to me. Right?
Exactly. So, like on iPhone, they make all their lenses almost very, very consistent. There's sometimes where it's a little bit off, but in general, you'll see like across 3 lenses on the back of the Pro, they all feel like it's one seamless camera. The color science is almost the same across all 3 lenses. And so that's just something Android still fails to do, and that's where they still need to catch up a lot,
Yes. So what worried me about Samsung in the last few years, like with the Note 10 and the S10 series, was that they were very good. Like, they were up in the upper tier of what we expect in terms of imaging from camera phones, but they didn't stand out as the best. And I felt that I was surprised that was the case, considering they'd been using essentially the same sensors for 2 or 3 years. And so I wasn't expecting this thing with brand new sensors to be super. I thought it'd be very good, but not to beat the iPhone out of the door, at least, because you need to tune it. And the biggest problem I've had is comparing these high megapixel count, sensors that do pixel binning 4:1 or 9:1, like this is doing 9:1. Is my gripe with that is that Sony sensors have, with the proper implementation, really nailed that. But I feel like Samsung sensors, every time I use a 48 megapixel or 64 megapixel Samsung sensor on a camera phone, I feel that the tuning is not good. The results are just not great. So I was thinking it's 108 megapixel sensor. I'm like, ugh. I mean, I haven't played with the CC9 from Xiaomi, which is the first phone that had that sensor. So I don't know. But I figured with Samsung on board making their own sensor, it would be acceptable and decent. But I knew it was going to be there was going to be issues, and also the amount of processing you need for that. And I'm also torn by the fact that they're using a 64 megapixel sensor for the telephone. And I want to pick your brain about that, because I feel like they're essentially cropping, right? They're using they're not using the whole sensor. The periscope lens is what, like a 3x optical or something, or 4x optical. It's not really that high of an optical zoom, right? And then they're actually using the fact that they have this massive 64 megapixel sensor. But then in low light, you got 0.8 micron pixels to deal with. So how do, like, when you zoom in a lot in low light, how does it behave? Because it can't pixel bin anymore. It would output a 2 megapixel photo if it did.
I mean, when you zoom in, it's not doing great. I mean, it's very bad. It's already...
Tell us about that experience, both in good light and in bad light.
I mean, in the zoom is, I'd say, all right, for a phone. We got to think about...
I mean, it's impressive. Is it as good as the Mate, the P30 Pro?
I didn't have enough time to play with the P30 Pro, so I can't really say how
It's up to about 30x the P30 Pro holds its own. Like, it's fine. But beyond that, ugh.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the upper zoom range is pretty garbage on all these phones. They're all using a hybrid, what they call like a hybrid zoom. So they're trying to combine cropping from the optical sensor with digital enhancement, right? And software
and
sharpening.
optics, all of it.
And so what you're getting is something that's better, but then digital zoom, just straight up digital zoom, but still not as good. So I would say for phones, they're pretty impressive, just because
I mean,
we're using phones.
Having 10x and 10x results come out good is going to benefit everyone. And that's the case with both these phones. I mean, I saw your photos. At 10x, it's solid. At 30x, it's usable. And I felt the same way about the P30 Pro. So you're absolutely right. Why wouldn't you want that, right?
Right. 10x is definitely acceptable. Like, you can definitely get great results with that. 30x, again, you're pushing it. But then anything beyond that is like, okay, why even bother? Because the image is going to look really bad, and then B, it's so shaky. Like the phone is the sensor, the viewfinder is so shaky.
Question for you: does it have OIS, or are they purely using electronic stabilization and counting on the fact that they're cropping?
My guess is that they're using electronic stabilization.
Yeah, they're counting on the cropping, which is fair. I mean, they have they're taking a tiny subsection of that 64 megapixel sensor and having a floating window floating around. But it sounds like it's not tuned right either.
Right. So, I mean, it's so shaky. That's why they have this little like crosshair in the upper left corner for you like aim properly so you know what you're seeing, because like when you're looking even on the big screen, it's almost impossible to see at like 100x what you're looking at, you know. Like you can't make out what you're seeing, so like you really have to like aim, and then even then it's like you have to keep your hand really steady. So I'd say at 100x without a tripod it's almost like impossible, and even with a tripod you get wind and stuff like that, and the slightest wind will really mess up your aim.
And kudos to Samsung for trying this. This is, again, computational photography in practice. You're taking a sensor that's much larger, you're cropping in real time a sub window of it to get your zoom, and then you're acting some optics for zooming to that, and then you're basically having this floating window that moves, and I think it could become a thing in the same way as computational photography in other areas has become a thing.
I mean, I want to know what Google would do with this. Give Google like this tech, let them experiment it, run wild, and apply their computational photography to it and machine learning and AI, and let's see what kind of like sharpened results they can get.
And I feel that Huawei would also have an advantage here because they have a lot more machine learning and AI research on imaging than Samsung does. Less than Google for sure. But like it's interesting to me. Like I want you to know, and I think you understand, Ray, but I think I want the audience to know that I'm not knocking Samsung here for trying something new on both this main sensor. Like I support this idea. I just knew when I saw the specs that this would be pretty difficult to get right out of the box, right? Like, and maybe in Gen 3 or 4 of this technology when they're doing the S40, no, I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm not saying you shouldn't go buy an S20 Ultra if that floats your boat. I'm just saying like, it's taken Huawei a few generations to get the 40 megapixel sensor that they have, the RYYB, the yellow pixel one.
Yes.
Kind of okay in terms of color science. And it's taken, Google a few tries to get, three pixel generations to get to a point where we felt really happy with their 12 megapixel sensor. And look at Apple. I mean, for a while there, until the 11, I didn't feel Apple had the crown for 2 years there.
Right. I mean, the 10S definitely was a step back for a lot of people just because the color science, the HDR, watercolor-like effect, as some people called it.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's really kind of what you're looking for. There are almost no bad premium smartphone cameras now.
No.
Everything is pretty darn acceptable, especially if you're posting Instagram, your Twitter, you're getting some compression there, and so everything looks pretty good, even low light stuff. Like, so, just having this extra power and on the S20 Ultra, yes, I'm impressed, but as a person who loves like shooting with their smartphone, like I go to CS, I've gone to CS for the last 2 years, and I've only shot with my iPhone and Pixel.
Same with me. So I kind of like dual carry. I have that my Pixel 4 XL. Well, at least now I have a Pixel 4 XL for main stills and telephoto stills, and I have an iPhone 11 non-Pro for ultra wide and for video. So I do all my video recording. I use Filmic Pro. I use a lav mic, and so I adjust my audio levels manually. I adjust my white balance manually. I adjust not my focus. I leave that on, but I do my what's it called? My EV, my exposure manually as well. And my videos, I feel, are so much better because of it. Even than what I was doing with my Sony NEX, where I can do all the same things. Like I can adjust everything manually, but I just feel like it's so much more convenient, right?
Yeah,
and
I mean,
do you shoot portrait mode? Because I use portrait mode on the Pixel and on the iPhone 11 to shoot products.
Sure. I mean, it really depends on the background for me. I usually generally just get closer because, you know, the aperture is pretty large. You get f1.8 or
I find
whatever.
the problem is with lighting. You get shadows and weird stuff when you get close.
Right. When you get close, your own shadow. I mean, there are a lot of tips and tricks we can get into in another podcast, maybe, about like
sure. I'll have you back. We can have a how to shoot proper video and stills as a tech journalist using phones.
For sure, I would love to go deep on that.
That'd be awesome.
But yeah, I mean, I think people just don't realize how much you can get out of your smartphone camera. And it's like, you know, there are manual settings, there are other apps, there are all sorts of things that you can do to make your images look better. And by the time you post it, no one really cares what you shot it with. You know, I've shot a lot of photos with a OnePlus, and, you know, OnePlus phones are generally like, you know, a generation or 2 generations behind the flagship of that year. And, you know, that's always the biggest knock. The cameras are just not quite there yet. You know, they just don't have the tuning chops. But, you know, with a little editing, with a little, like, you know, with pro mode and all that stuff, you know, with more like knowledge of how to shoot with it, you can definitely get an image out there, post it up, and nobody would ever know. You know, like people think it was shot with like a Samsung or.
I mean, the mid range today, like a $300 to $500 phone today that you buy new now, that just came out in the last 3 months or so, will basically beat a flagship from 3 years ago.
Right.
That's the reality.
I'd say, really, again, this is nothing new. Focus on your composition, focus on your framing, focus on your editing, and, you know, work on those things. That's way more important than, you know, how sharp a photo is, because on Instagram and Twitter, it just doesn't matter, you know?
It's so funny, you know, I often shoot, like, with these cheaper review phones, like, you know, weird rugged phones from Shenzhen that are, like, you know, questionable in terms of camera performance. And when I post the photos, people are like, wow, this looks great. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I could probably make a good photo happen with a VGA camera from 2000. Like, you know, I mean, just give me a chance, right? Like, I know it's not practical for people who are trying to document their kids growing up and they're running around. And this is where you need the flagships. This is where you need, like, you know, what we're going to talk about next with the Sony phones, which is like eye autofocus and 30 frame and 20 frame per second burst and all that. But I think, like, overall, you're right. If you buy anything that's I'd say 500 or more today, you're gonna be able to take some phenomenal photos in pretty much any setting and video, you know? Right.
I mean, ultimately, I think Samsung had a miss here. Unfortunately, you know, their best isn't the best in terms of being a pro.
I wonder how the
camera.
S20 and S20 Plus compare, because, you know, they're still using that 12 megapixel sensor.
Right, and they're using the dual pixel autofocus, which is superior. So, yeah, I definitely want to get those two in hand and to try out soon. A lot of people had asked me that yesterday after our story published, and everyone's just like, okay, but how does the S20 and S20 Plus compare? They have different sensors and also just different autofocus systems. And so my guess is, you know, they will outperform the S20 Ultra in terms of, like, the autofocus. Now, if you want the kind of professional manual settings and capabilities that the S20 Ultra affords you, you know, the being able to switch to 108 megapixel mode, being able to switch to 40 megapixel selfie mode. If you want that kind of manual control, and, you know, whether it's for shooting landscapes or whatnot, then the S20 Ultra, you can't go wrong. You know, you can focus on it by yourself, tap, lock focus, all that good stuff. But if you're looking to shoot video, yeah, I would stay away from the S20 Ultra, at least until there's a patch that claims they'll fix it. You know, it's just, you cannot shoot any kind of video where the subject is constantly, you know, hunting, going in and out, popping in and out in terms of focus. Like, it's just not acceptable. Even like a Galaxy Note 10, you know, has the superior, like, dual pixel autofocus system, and so that is a better video camera than even the S20 Ultra.
Or just get an iPhone if you want to do video and call it a day.
Pretty much, yeah.
I mean,
you cannot
beat
iPhone in terms of video. Like, stabilization and all that.
So it's 108 megapixel. Does that sensor have OIS, or is that electronic as well? I hope it does have OIS.
I believe it does have OIS.
That would make sense, because you want to use the entire sensor. You
right,
don't wanna,
right. The weird thing is that when you're shooting 8K video, it does not have stabilization at all.
Of course it doesn't, because it's too computationally intensive.
Right.
And it does 8K at 24, right?
Right. So
yeah. I mean, that's a gimmick at this point.
Well, it's gonna be a gimmick.
24.
I mean, real artists and real filmmakers, they shoot at 24. When I go to Filmic Pro, I shoot at 24 for some of my smaller projects. But yeah, I mean, this is where Apple has a big advantage, right? With their custom silicon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just because of how like power efficient and how powerful their A series chips are, I think Apple could do this 8K, 24 or 30 or 60 FPS and do it way better just because they have the chips to do it.
I mean, are they the only ones still that do 4K 60 on the front camera? I don't think anyone else is doing that.
Don't quote me on this, but I think they might be.
I mean, maybe Samsung on this generation.
I know they're the only ones who do 4K 60 on all their cameras
and stabilized.
Which
is crazy talk.
Right. And so I shoot at full res everything, 4K 60, 4K 30. I don't like pro non-high efficiency mode, right?
Yeah.
And so like I get the full readout, and so yeah, I mean they're big files. I've pushed my iPhone really hard and pushed my Android phones really really hard, and I think that truly nobody can keep up with what Apple's doing because they've really got an integrated system here. And everyone else is relying on Qualcomm's chips, which are better year over year, but they still lag behind Apple, and Apple's always
it's that vertical integration. And you feel that with Huawei as well. I feel that having their own Kirin chips, I feel that I'm not saying their image processing is faster or better, but they certainly have a leg up in terms of integrating it all together.
Right.
And you feel that sometimes in, just the speed of processing autofocus. Like, how on the Pixel 4, you still see the, when you take a shot, sometimes you see it applying the HDR plus.
Right.
It's much faster than it was on the 3 and the 2, but you see it, and you don't really see that on a Huawei phone or an iPhone. It's just boom, there's your photo, right? Done.
Exactly.
So we talked about the telephoto, 64 megapixel without OIS and with a folded lens or periscope lens. What about the ultra wide? What's your experience been with ultra wide on the S20 Ultra?
I mean, I think it's fine.
It's a 12, right?
It's a 12 megapixel sensor resolution camera, and I did comparisons with the Galaxy Note 10 and iPhone 11 Pro, and outdoors they look fine, but in low light it kind of falls apart in the corners, and you definitely get more image noise.
How is low light in general on the S20 Ultra with this 9:1 pixel binning on the main sensor? What are the f-stops on all these lenses? Do you know off the top of your head?
I believe the ultra wide is f1.8.
That's not bad for an ultra wide.
I mean, they're ultra wides. There's no OIS for this particular lens. No. There's never been for ultra wide.
It's really not that much of a need, honestly, unless you're shooting video and then you need like that GoPro stabilization style.
Well, I mean, I disagree. I feel like I love to see OIS on all the cameras.
Me too, ideally, but I feel like the ultra wide is probably the one you could probably get away with electronic stabilization if your sensor was big enough.
Sure.
I'd rather see larger pixels, honestly. I'd rather see like an 8 megapixel sensor with large pixels that crops down to 6 or 7 megapixel and has a bit of EIS on an ultra wide. And we're not seeing that right now. I mean, now that I've used the Mate 30 Pro from Huawei that has that 40 megapixel for the ultra wide, it's insane, Ray. It's like you've never seen ultra wide pictures in low light this good.
I mean, ultra wides, I love shooting with the ultra wide cameras on all the phones. And the most disappointing thing is just low light performance, right? It's just softer. There's more image noise, even indoors. Where there's still quite a bit of luminance, it just doesn't look as good. And especially on video, you can see the artifacts. So I would like to see some more improvements there. I know ultra wides are supposed to be more for like landscapes where there's like less things moving around, but like I'm not out.
I love using
mountains.
ultra wide as for street photography. So that's why when low light happens in street photography. I think low light happens. Period. I want to get a T-shirt printed that says "low light happens."
Do it
so that people can be reminded of how important that is on the phone. So is the main sensor doing well with that 9:1 pixel binning? What's the experience been on that?
It's doing all right. I wouldn't say. Yeah, I think it's doing fine. That's a default setting, 9:1. It's not full 108 megapixels, so you're still getting 12 megapixel photos out of the camera, right?
Right.
And so, it looks good. You guys can scroll through all the examples. Let me know how they compare. If there are any other comparisons.
It did look really good, yeah. I thought it held its own night mode and everything as well.
Absolutely. It definitely, you can see there's more resolution compared to, Note 10. You can see, especially in the night mode of the kind of the skyline and the Brooklyn Bridge, you can see that the water is, more detailed. There are more highlights. And overall, it's just a better image. And again, on Instagram, on Twitter,
you won't see it. Yeah,
you won't see it really. It's gonna be comparable to previous gen if you know what you're doing. So unfortunately, I don't think this is the best camera in a smartphone. I was hoping that it would be. I was just hoping it would just spec out, beast out, and crush everybody else. Maybe not necessarily the iPhone, but come really darn close. But Apple's tuning is just next level. I didn't expect some of these photos to be using Deep Fusion, and I almost completely actually forgot about Deep Fusion.
We do, and that's the beauty of Apple, right? You forget about the stuff.
Well, it's an automatic mode, and you don't know when it kicks in. But I use an app called Metafo. And
I've seen that.
It was able to let me see the metadata and see which shots were deeply fused. And so that's why certain shots, like the food comparison, even though the Samsung should have beaten it, 9 pixels to 1, in that kind of mild low light performance, the iPhone just crushed it on another level with detail. What the heck? This is a 12 megapixel sensor. How did it do that?
Yeah.
And we're talking about the sweater mode, Deep Fusion, that's just really working. And it doesn't work on every shot. You don't know when it kicks in, but right when you hit that sweet spot, it uses whatever machine learning it's got processed and been trained on to really just bring out all those sharp details, and you're like, wow. Holy cow.
We're seeing a lot of that. Right now, I don't know if you saw people taking old films and upsampling the frame rate and the resolution and coloring, colorizing them using AI. Right. And it's not perfect, but damn, if really this is good, now in 2020, I can't imagine what it's going to be in 2030. We might be able to watch Star Trek The Next Generation in 4K 60 frames per second, AI upscaled.
I think so.
Because right now that's the challenge, right? A lot of the TV shows we love, classic TV shows are, unfortunately, were shot on video, not on film. If they're on film, it's easy to make them 4K. But when they're shot 4:3 aspect ratio,
right?
Video at some crappy, pretty much 240 pixel resolution, it's rough. Yeah. I'm excited about AI for that. I think that's a perfect example how machine learning can knock it out the park, right?
Totally.
Yeah. So how is the before we move on to the next few topics, how is the telephoto in low light?
It's again,
it's rough,
also,
right?
It's not the best, I wouldn't say it's terrible, to be honest. Every camera is gonna be different just because there's different tuning again. But at low zoom ranges, I'd say 5x, 4x, 10x, it still looks pretty damn good. It just falls apart after 10x. I'd say really you're looking at some really mushy, muddy details, and more image noise.
How does it do at that weird little in below where the optical folding lens lives, like 2x, because that's the challenge with the P30 Pro. It's a 5x optical, right? So you're below 5x, right? You're using that 40 megapixel main sensor, and I think it's actually using two sensors, the telephoto and it kind of sends both data to the image processing pipe to kind of get some more data out of it. But it struggles a little bit, I find, compared to, say, the P20 prior to it, which only had a 3 times optical, because, that 2 times is a pretty common, upsize. Of course, with a 108 megapixel sensor, even at 9:1 pixel binning, you probably get some pretty great result at 2x, right? You don't need the telephoto lens for that.
I mean, at 2x, it's okay. It has a pretty small aperture. We're talking the telephoto lens has a f3.5 aperture, so there's not as much light going into the lens.
That's a challenge for sure.
And so, couple that with a larger image sensor, resolution, and you're going to get some more challenging shots, shooting capabilities, right?
What's the f-stop on that main lens? Do you know?
The main lens, the 108 megapixel.
Yeah.
It's a f1.8.
Yeah, that's all right. I kind of was really excited when they were doing f4 1.4, 1.5, 1.6 on all phones. That seems to have gone away, though.
F1.4? I don't know if I've seen that. What phone has
I think
that?
it was LG. I think somebody was doing
know,
1.4, 1.5. I can't remember.
1.6. I remember F1.6
well,
on LG.
Huawei does 1.6 on their high-end main
right.
sensors.
I mean,
LG did 1.6 for a while.
Somebody should fact check us because, I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever seen 1.5 or even 1.4 on a smartphone.
I've seen it. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty confident. I can't remember which phones though.
Somebody tweeted us.
Somebody did. Definitely not Apple. Apple's always done 1.8 or something.
Right.
It's 1.7ish, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Correct us in Twitter because I am pretty convinced. At least I'm not 100% sure 1.4, but 1.5 I have seen 1.5.
All right. I'm going to have to do a poll about this.
And I'm pretty sure it was somebody like LG, but or maybe Huawei. I don't know. Speaking of LG, do you want to switch gears and talk about the V60 ThinQ 5G? We both got hands on with it. You in New York, me in San Francisco. And I don't want to be a downer because I love LG, okay? I think LG for a long time did some really great imaging work. In fact, I feel like the G8 last year, non-X, was totally underrated in terms of imaging. A lot of people didn't just shot with it and were like, yeah, it's good. It's up there with the best, but never really dug deep. But the low light on that phone was kind of insane. In my review, I found that it was particularly impressive. So, but that was also a much faster f-stop. I think it's f1.6. And so, at f1.6, so the 12 megapixel sensor with large pixel sizes, OIS, if you've perfected your imaging pipeline over years, which LG has, the G4 was a stellar camera for its time.
For sure.
I think it's not impossible to get good results. But then with the G8X and the V60, and that's the reason I bring it up, they're going back to f1.8, and I think it's a cost-saving issue. But I'm not very happy to see these companies that have made fast lenses in the past make slower lenses to save money, because I don't think you can. Better glass is always better glass. Right? So anyway, that's my gripe with it. That and the 1080p display.
I definitely agree on all the points that you just hit.
And the lack of telephoto.
I mean, LG's in a very tight spot, right? They're losing money from their mobile division. They're not selling as many phones, and honestly, it's truly lost a lot of its luster, in terms of reach and presence and market share. LG is still very big in South Korea, and Samsung and LG are still big titans over there, but look at these specs. I'm looking at specs right now, and you got a 64 megapixel main shooter with f1.9 aperture.
Wait, the main shooter? You're talking about the ultra wide? Because I think the ultra wide.
The main shooter. So the ultra wide is a 13 megapixel camera, and so yeah, I mean, we're talking about some specs that are not great, compared to what they've done before. And again, like you also just mentioned, there's no telephoto, what the heck?
Yeah, it's weird. So, I was right. So I'm looking at my G8 review. The f-stop on that main camera is f over 1.5.
Okay.
f over 1.5 OIS, 12 megapixel, 1.4 micron. And the ultra-wide have at f over 1.9, which for an ultra-wide is stupid fast lens.
Right.
So they still have an f over 1.9 ultra-wide on the V60, but their main lens on the V60 is not. It's not fast. I can't remember what it was. The specs were conflicting, so I'm not sure. I have to look.
Right. So, I mean, ultimately, LG's in a tight spot. I think what they're really pushing for is this, hey, look, we are selling these phones, our flagship phones, with this dual screen accessory. And we saw that
That's
with
the shtick, right?
right. We saw that with the G8X. If you, in the US at least, if you bought the G8X ThinQ, you got the accessory, and it was a pretty good bundle. It was like, I think it was like $700 for both together. So you're getting like 2 screens for $700 or $700. And LG really has no more cards to play, unfortunately.
Have they announced pricing officially on this? Because they said they would be really aggressive.
No, they have not. Yeah.
My understanding, and I'm just like, this is my thoughts more on like, looking at the spec sheet, like without a telephoto, I'm looking at the actual official LG specs that they emailed this morning. Mm-hmm. The main lens is f1.8, which compared to 1.5 last year on the G8 is bleh. But anyway, that and the 1080p display instead of 2K, which I don't really care about personally, but I feel like as a cost cutting and the lack of telephoto means to me that, they kind of hinted that they would be competitive with the entry level S20, but I think this is going to undercut the S20 when it finally hits the carriers quite a bit and still include the dual screen, which is, I think, the shtick, as I said. But I don't find the dual screen very helpful. Like, I use the G8X dual screen, and I kind of wanted to pull the phone out and just use it as a phone. And then I was like, well, that makes it kind of a crappy flagship now, does it? When you look at it in the vacuum without the case, it's the same with the V60. It's like, okay, yeah, it has a lot of good specs, like 865, and it's got like 5G, and it's 64 megapixel main sensor. That's kind of why they said they don't have a telephoto, right? Which we should digest that in a second, because and I have issues around that. 5,000 milliamp hour battery, that's really good.
That's really good for a 1080p screen,
But at the same time,
if you're putting on that dual screen, then it's going to suck more battery,
And that dual screen is kind of useless. So you probably ended up using it as a normal phone. And at that point, it's no longer a flagship. It doesn't feel like a flagship with these compromises.
I disagree that it's useless. I think there's definitely some interesting functionality there, and, multitasking. I actually, oddly enough, enjoyed using it, except for the kind of way you activate the dual screen. I think the UI for that is terrible, because I think
the UI in general is terrible.
It's just not intuitive. It's like, for example, launching the gamepad, you have to launch it on the second screen, but it shows up on the other screen. It's weird. Shouldn't the app that you launch on the screen that you opened it on? It's very funky. But I personally actually did enjoy using having a Twitter feed and my Feedly open at the same time, just because I always have those two apps. I feel that I
always have to set it up, and it's just more work to set it up than to just use it.
Right.
And though I end up realizing after, at first I was like, this is cool. Let me try it out. Let me use multiple apps at the same time. And then after a while, I was like, it's a kind of hassle to use in terms of experience, user interface.
Right. It's a hassle.
And so I was like, then after a week, I was like, I'm carrying extra weight and an extra case that's using battery that I don't need. And so I took it away. And then I was like, well, this phone is not horrible. It meets all the bare minimum essentials. But for the price and for, a quote unquote flagship, I'd much rather have a OnePlus 7T at this point.
I would too. I mean, there are other things that LG wants to differentiate itself with this phone. It's got 5G. It's got
the awesome audio, the
awesome audio.
The 3.5 millimeter.
Yeah, it's got headphone jack
with its quad DAC, which is still the best in my opinion. Other than buying $1,000 external DAC, you're not gonna get better anywhere else.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a fine phone. It's an underrated phone, I think. Unfortunately, I just don't think it's going to move the needle at all for LG. It's not going to save them at all. No. I think their time is over, much like, HTC, Sony.
Yeah, exactly.
And unfortunately, they just got buried, and that was years in the making, and, they're trying to fight for relevancy now, and it's just not going to work.
And to me, this feels like another version of that. I'm just like this. They're putting all this eggs into this dual screen thing, which we know is not the future. Maybe I'll eat my words when the Microsoft Surface Duo comes out.
Sure.
But you know what I'm saying? I don't feel that's where we're going. I don't feel that's where, as Gruber would say, where the puck is. I should be skating where the puck is gonna be, not where it is now.
Right.
And I don't feel they're doing that. I feel like the spec sheet is okay. Like it's pretty solid. It's 90% there for flagship. The cost I think is going to be very competitive, and that's good. But you're appeasing the carriers. LG is still making phones for carriers,
Exactly.
not for consumers, and they've got to stop that. Like even Samsung stopped doing that 5 years ago. Like
I don't think they
on.
can. They can't stop doing that because they're, they have so little market share that in order for any carrier to even bother stocking their phones,
What if they make an
have,
S20 Ultra that costs 1,000 instead of 1,500 and undercut Samsung and present that to the carriers?
I mean, I think that's still going to be a hard sell. The components, the build costs for
they
the
don't
S20,
have the economies of scale, do they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think it's going to happen, unfortunately. LG's positioning this almost like, they weren't affirmative on it, but it's pretty obvious to me that they're positioning it as kind of a alternative to the foldable phones that are out there, Samsung's Z Flip, Galaxy Fold, and Razer. And this is like, okay, well, durability sucks on those phones, but the durability on this is amazing because it's not actually a screen that folds in half,
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I just don't think it'll work. And it sucks because,
it sucks because they're stuck. I mean,
they're
and
stuck.
they're stuck. And also they're making these compromises in terms of spec sheet. They're positioning this as their best phone, but they're making compromise to keep the price down to appease the carriers so that they can bundle the dual display. And it's just all snowballs downhill like a terrible disaster in the making. Like, I just feel like, I'm not going to say no to this. So I'm not going to not recommend this one. I'm sure it's going to be very competent, just like the G8 that I reviewed last year and the G8X that I used but didn't review last year. And but still overall, I'm just like, where is the excitement? Where is the enthusiasm? As an audio person, yeah, I can see this being a good choice. The camera, I'm really worried when, Hubert of Uber Gizmo and I were both at the briefing here and we asked, who makes the sensor? And they were super cagey. Like, that's when like, is this an OmniVision? Please tell me this is not an OmniVision sensor. It's like Samsung sensor, maybe. But if it's a Sony sensor, I'm much more on board. Like, why can't you tell us? Like, what's the issue here? Like, this is important. This is the stuff that we generally can get a good feel. If it's a Sony sensor, we know it's going to be doing better at this pixel binning than, say, a Samsung sensor will right now. And so it has actually 3 cameras on the back. There's a time of flight camera on the back, so don't get that confused with a telephoto because there isn't. Right. And so how do you feel about their spiel that you don't need a telephoto when you have a 64 megapixel? Well, my question then is, okay, at 2 times or 4 times zoom, are you no longer pixel binning then? Because in low light, it's going to fall apart, especially at f of 1.8.
Well, I think... the way they see it is that most people just don't use their telephoto lenses too often, right? And so, they can definitely do portrait mode
with
effects,
the time of flight, yeah.
Right, without a
and that's fair.
Telephoto lens, so they're saving some costs there. And unfortunately, I think it's, valuable. I think having that full range from ultra wide to telephoto just gives you more creative capabilities, and so for us to kind of walk back on that feels like a major step back. And again, the whole phone itself is a story of cutbacks, right? And I think that it just shows how stuck LG is. They can't pack it they simply cannot pack their latest flagship with the best specs anymore.
I mean, to me, this feels like a OnePlus phone, spec-wise. And even OnePlus does better because they have a telephoto.
Exactly. OnePlus is doing way more interesting stuff. They have the scale. That's the thing. They have the scale that LG just doesn't now, right?
Well, because BBK group, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't
want to dismiss it because I enjoyed using it for the 30 minutes I spent with it. I always feel very comfortable with LG phones. I pick them up and everything feels familiar and everything's in the right place. And it's pleasant, but it's not like it doesn't get my blood, pumping and doesn't get me excited at all. So the specs are, 1080p 6.8 inch display, 8 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of storage with micro SD,
Mm-hmm.
64 megapixel standard camera, f1.8 and OIS. And
You know what? I didn't see any kind of wireless charging there on the spec sheet.
It's got wireless charging. I confirmed it.
Okay.
It's got
good.
wireless charging. It's got 25 watt wired charging, 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and they didn't say how fast the wireless was. I figure it's like probably 10 or 15.
Did they
And
say what kind of 5G it supported? Like millimeter or
so
sub-6?
from what I remember is it's either or. It's like everything on X55. You either get sub 6 or you get millimeter. And if you get millimeter, you might get low band with millimeter, but you won't get mid band.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's either mid band and low or mid band and high, right? Millimeter.
Sure.
13 megapixel ultra wide f1.9 time of flight camera. There's a 10 megapixel front. The front camera is interesting because 10 megapixel f1.9 is good, and then 1.22 micron pixels. That front camera, I don't know if it has autofocus, but especially if it does have autofocus, which LG's done in the past, would be pretty dope. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. 5,000 milliamp hour battery though is pretty exciting to me. That's sweet.
5,000 milliamp hours plus a 1080p display. That's just a battery king.
Even with two 1080p displays in this case, like if you use the dual screen accessory.
I mean, I actually thought the battery life was pretty good with
the G8X.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't bad considering. Good. Yeah. I mean, those are OLED displays, so they're probably pretty efficient. In-display fingerprint sensor. Yeah, I mean, look, headphone jack and quad jack. This is not a bad spec sheet, but let's see how it goes. I want to see a price, and I want to see, I want to use it, especially the camera, because it might surprise us. It might. So we'll see. We'll find out. Speaking of cameras and Sony and sensors and Samsung and sensors, Sony came out with new phones.
Yep.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, they are.
You said Sony is like on their way out, like HTC earlier. So,
I mean, Sony.
I don't think they are though. See, that's the thing. Sony, it's like and LG. I think where HTC didn't have the advantage is Sony and LG. LG sells fridges and washing machines that are going to subsidize the mobile business.
Sure.
And Sony sells TVs and other really awesome consumer electronics like PlayStation that's going to subsidize the phones. I actually feel like Sony phones are in for the long run and are always going to be a niche item. They're going to be always expensive and quirky and weird. And for that, I kind of love them, to be honest with you.
I mean, I love the idea for sure. I love seeing underdogs, right? And I especially love, everyone's like, just give up already. But I love seeing like companies like HTC or LG or Sony, like they're still trying, right? And like you said, for Sony and LG, their mobile division can be subsidized by the rest of their business, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is, like, Sony used to be interesting in terms of like smartphones. The last real Sony phone I was really interested in was maybe like the Z3, right? And I was like, amazing battery life. They also made a compact version of that.
Oh, that was so good.
It was so good. And it was like flagship everything, had the box design. And like now they've really just like leaned way more in terms of like the imaging and their camera overlap, right?
But I kind of like that they finally woke up and realized, oh, hey, we have an entire camera division that's kicking ass. For a long time they were afraid of cannibalizing their camera business with mobile, remember? And we would never remember that for the longest, until the Xperia 1 last summer, there wasn't a single Sony phone with OIS. Yet they make most sensors and lens systems for everyone else with OIS. That kind of killed me.
I mean, it's a lot of stuff that just didn't make a lot of sense, to be honest. And this phone, these phones that they've announced, Xperia 1, 2, they teased an Xperia Pro.
And Xperia 10 too, yeah.
I mean, it's all very confusing, right? There's like
I kind of like the Mark II, though. That's kind of a Sony thing. A lot of people are pissed off by the name. I'm like, you don't understand. That's how they call the alpha cameras. That's how they call like their headphones, Right.
I mean, I don't. Sony's going for this like ultra high end, where it's so niche, like you just said, right?
Yeah.
They have their niche Walkmans that like still alive and they're for pure audiophiles. Then they have these like cameras that are really great, and then they have these, now they're trying to push out these smartphones that, you know, are supposed to plug into your video camera and act as a little monitor, and, you know, has HDMI output or input, and, like, you know, has these multiple cameras on the back. I don't know, it's got this like weird super skinny 21:9 aspect ratio because most people are shooting with their cameras are shooting in that,
and I love that
ratio.
they call it a 4K display, but it's really a 3K display, because at that
Right.
aspect ratio you're cutting off a bunch
You're
of
cutting off
pixels.
a bunch of stuff.
Sorry,
I mean,
folks.
I mean, it's not UHD is what it is not.
No.
And so here's my thing. Sony has had all this experience making smartphone sensors and selling them to other phone makers, and yet for year over year their image tuning has been garbage.
I agree.
The company that makes the sensors, that is the most, you know, should know the most about their own shit, doesn't know how to make the image quality look good. And I looked back at, like, you know, my year over year comparisons before this podcast. I'm like, yeah, why is the color so bad on Sony phones? It's always been bad, you know, compared to an iPhone 6 way back, you know, Xperia Z3, I mean, it's just never been good, you know?
No.
How could a company that makes the sensors not be able to tune the software so that the picture quality is just like impeccable, kind of like their alpha cameras, you know? Like, how?
They
just
claim
seems...
that they're trying and that this is their second gen, and it's, you know, I want to see the delivery, because when they claim that on the Xperia 1 and the Xperia 5, by the way, I like the 5 way better than the 1 because it's much more affordable and a better battery life and better form factor, smaller. But it didn't deliver. Like the spec sheet was there, but the images weren't there, right? You played with it. It wasn't that good.
Right. I mean, the fact is, this phone is not going to matter. Not even to the cinema files. And the reason why it's not going to matter to even like the filmmakers is because guess what's in their pocket? An iPhone. And guess what takes the best video? An iPhone.
An iPhone. Yeah.
Exactly.
I do like a few things in there, though. I do like that. I do find it interesting they're sticking with a triple camera system that's 12 megapixel across the board. So they're using large pixel sizes. That's making me happy. I'm happy about that they have a photo pro mode that replicates the alpha camera's UI. That should be interesting. I'm not sure if, you know, this is a selling point. I mean, as you said, nobody's going to buy this. So
I mean,
this is all hypothetical at this point.
I don't think it's a selling point because the demographic that actually goes into manual mode on their phone is going to buy a
Fuji
small.
camera or an actual alpha camera.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
They're just not. The thing is, like, unless this thing had like a massive sensor, you know, really went toe to toe with like their RX 100 series, this thing is not moving the needle, man. I mean, all the eye tracking in the world is not going to make this phone
I do like
appealing,
that, though.
you
That's
know?
the one thing that stands out to me. By the way, we didn't mention it. So it can do 20 frame per second burst, which nobody cares about on a phone, but it can. But it does. What's more interesting is that 60 frame per second, so 3 times for each of these 20 frame per second shots. It can track eyes, and if it doesn't see eyes, it can track faces, and it does that very, very quickly in real time, at least on the demos we saw. We haven't touched these phones because this is not MWC, this podcast, right? Like, this is the stuff they were going to show us at MWC.
We would have touched these phones, you know?
Correct. We would have been able to put that to the test. But look, I'm going to get a review in it and take it through its paces. I have to. This is kind of fascinating to me. Like, I kind of want to believe, because I love Sony products and I love especially their camera products.
Me too.
And I want to believe that one day they'll get their head out of their ass and deliver something that will be competitive and surprise us. So,
I mean, I think it might just be us, you know, we're an older generation, perhaps, right? And, you know, we loved Sony. We had Sony growing up, and they always made cool stuff. But come on, the new kids, they just have no affinity. They have like no connection to Sony. They could care less what happens to these, like, this brand. It's doesn't connect with them, and so it doesn't matter to them at all.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, it's a niche player, but I think, like LG, they can subsidize that niche, and they're going to continue.
Yeah, but for how long? You know,
well,
Sony's two biggest money making businesses are PlayStation and the imaging division, right?
Oh, and the imaging. Yeah, you're right. It does
and
do
so
very well.
Sony has been losing so much money. I don't have the report up, the latest report, but like they continue to bleed money. This division is like I mean, I'm surprised they didn't just sell it off already, spin it off and sell it off, because that's
like
what
they did with Vio.
Right, that's what Kaz Hirai was doing with almost everything that was losing money. They spun it off, sold it off, and just like
Yep.
their money making stuff is their PlayStation, their imaging stuff, and their movie business. And even then, it's like they had to cancel what was that PlayStation View, right? They had to kill PlayStation View because it's just couldn't be competitive enough. Streaming wars there's just too many players now, and so I don't know, man. I just see this as another losing phone. Personally, the geek in me, like you, we definitely want to play with these things.
I mean, I'll drink the Kool-Aid on this one. Send it my way, Sony. Like, I mean, okay. I want to continue because we've got a bunch of more news to cover. But just quickly for the listeners, check out the show notes. I'll have a link to a Verge article that spells out all the 3 phones that were announced. There's the Xperia 1, 2, which is Mark II, Xperia 1 next generation, if you want, which we just discussed. Then Xperia 10 Mark II, which is kind of like a remake of their mid-range 10 phone. And then there's an Xperia Pro, which is basically the same as the Xperia 1, but with 5G millimeter wave instead of low band sub-6. And that thing has an HDMI input, so you can use it as a display for a video camera, like an HDMI monitor. But it also lets you take that HDMI stream and broadcast it over 5G millimeter. And apparently they have some broadcast equipment that's compatible with that. So this is really a pro play for the television studio people.
I think this phone...
Bizarre product.
I mean, 5G millimeter wave streaming, I mean, it sounds amazing, but like this year, next year, no, not even. Maybe in this is 5 years out, this phone...
this might work in Japan, actually, potentially.
Exactly.
That's the thing. Like, their broadcast, television stations in Japan might be outfitted with this stuff. Who knows?
Right.
But it's interesting. Huawei announced a bunch of stuff at not MWC. Quickly going to go through that. There's a Mate XS, which is not to be confused with iPhone XS. Mate XS, which is their Mate X from last year, their folding phone, updated with new specs, and we'll go through that in a second. There's also MateBook X Pro, an updated version of their awesome 15-inch MacBook Pro competitor laptop. And then there's always a tablet. I didn't put it down in the show notes, but they made an iPod Pro ripoff, just like Samsung did recently. And I want your thoughts on, maybe very briefly, on the Mate XS. What are your thoughts on this? It feels like a desperate attempt to stay relevant in the folding space when Samsung's eating everybody's lunch.
Yep. I mean,
I love Huawei, but this is what it feels like to me.
The most important thing Huawei needs to do was to prove how much more durable this version is. Correct. And they said they said something, They
redid the hinge, apparently. It's got 125 more parts.
Okay, I mean, I don't know what that really means in the real world, but, like, tell me whether this thing will scratch with my fingernail.
And it will.
And it will. I mean, the screen
is
folding outward.
Screen. Yeah.
And so, the X, I think, it only launched in China, so it was very limited release, and I honestly haven't heard much about it since.
Ben Sin, who lives in Hong Kong, he played with one.
Okay.
There's a few people that have posted some good reviews, or rather some good content around them. I didn't mean positive reviews, I meant good content. Right. And I'm honestly, if somebody plumped a Mate X or Mate XS in front of me and said, you have it for a week, have fun, I think I'd have a really good time with it.
Yeah, but a week is not enough. A week is not enough to tell you anything about these.
But then again, look at what Samsung did with the Galaxy Flip review units. One day, everybody had to pre-order theirs. I missed the pre-order board, and I still can't buy one.
I know. I expect that to happen. I mean, same thing for Razer, right? It was pretty embarrassing for Razer. Yeah. I don't even know if I really want to get into that one. But a quick 411 is just like, my Razer that I only played with, and this was like our editor-in-chief's Josh's Razer. He bought it, and he reviewed it, and I picked it up a week later, literally exactly a week later, and had it for 24 hours, and it delaminated.
We covered that on the show quite extensively a couple of weeks back. It's amazing to me,
And how I don't know how it happened. I'm still... My mind is blown right now. I'm like, I don't know how it happened. If you touch the device, you would see that there's no physical damage to the screen surface. It's smooth as can be, but the only places that's cracking are the two side hinges right at the hinge. Like, I mean, it's pretty obvious what happened.
Did they replace it for you? Did you end up
No, we didn't.
like getting it dissected by anybody?
No, I mean, Josh still has the device, and we're still trying to. I don't know if he's over the phone or trying to figure. It's completely wrecked. He told me.
Suggest to Josh that he gives it to Zach at JRig Everything, since iFixit won't touch it.
Yeah, I mean, I
don't even want to get started on this because I still don't have a review in it. They still don't want to give anybody a review.
I don't think they really want people messing around with these things.
That does not inspire confidence, folks.
I don't think any foldable that launches is going to have a traditional review unit where they let press play with it for any kind of like extended period of time, longer than like
ridiculous to me.
I mean, that just shows, again, like you just said, the lack of confidence they have in these products, because
unfortunately the Mate XS, going back to topic, is not the phone. I mean, it's not the one that's going to solve this problem. It's still a plastic screen. It's still a plastic screen on the outside. But kudos to Huawei for trying to stay in the race with an improved version of this phone. I'm sure they're working on a clamshell now. Like, this seems to be the hot thing. Have you played with those Huawei laptops, the MateBook X Pro, etc. in the past?
I have. I actually own one. I bought one.
Oh, it's a great laptop.
It's a great laptop.
Now it has a 10th gen Intel, and it comes in green.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm not going to go into more detail on that. I'll have a link in the show notes about an article. But I'm excited that they continue to update it. I do wish that pop-up camera and the keyboard would go away and go back up to the bezel, because I don't think that's a really good thing. But
oh man, that's where I disagree too. I like that.
You like it?
Well, I rarely use my webcam.
I just don't feel it gives me a good like.
It's a bad angle.
Yeah,
it's a very bad angle.
Not good angle. That's.
But I rarely use the webcam on my laptop, and on my MacBook, my work issue.
It's nice that you can physically hide it. Like, I like that.
Right. So I have a piece of tape on my MacBook right now, and I love that about the Mate, because like, I rarely use it, maybe like less than a handful of times a year, and that way I know there's never anything like looking at me. But I love the computer itself. The bezels are
such a good machine.
So thin. And the graphics chip is like better than the Intel stuff. And there are plenty of ports, and the keyboard's fantastic, and it's just a good solid build quality. And so yeah, I mean, I'm glad they're updating it.
Me too. Moving on quickly, I want to finish with this topic. There's a couple of more after that, but I think they're not that important. Another not MWC announcement is that Oppo has launched their Realme brand, the X50, which looks really interesting for $500-$600 in terms of specs. It's got a 90 hertz display. It's got all the latest Snapdragon goodness, 865. It's got 5G, obviously, which is what's kind of amazing. A $500 phone with 5G that's got top specs. 3 cameras on the back. 65-watt super fast charging. Those Chinese phones are pretty amazing. I mean, I just love the spec sheets on these. How do you feel?
I think they're pushing the limits of what a mid-range phone is.
I call them affordable flagships.
Affordable flagships, if you want to call them that. But they're getting very confusing, you know? If you look at this like Realme
Not that it matters to anybody out here.
Not really, but also, I mean, it's confusing for a lot of people, you know? Just because like this one has like the previous version, the Realme X50, had a 120 hertz display, and the new one, the Pro version, X50 Pro, has a 90 hertz display.
What?
So it's like, I don't know what they're doing there. What are they doing there? Like, what are you really doing, you know? And so, I mean, I get it. They're pushing out the tech out as soon as it's ready, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, it's like, okay, you're paying more, but you're getting less, and then you're paying less, but you're getting more somehow here. And so, like, all the spec charts are, like, all scrambled and messed up. And, yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I think the Realme stuff has been slowly clawing its way up to the top very quickly.
I mean, it's super popular in India.
Super popular. And, you know, the pricing is very on point and very key to their success. But, again, out here in the US, nobody's buying these phones, so doesn't really matter to me too much. But I think in Asia, you're seeing bigger brands like Samsung and LG and other phone makers, they're feeling the squeeze real hard.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think even Apple might be feeling a squeeze in India.
Right. Well, I think Oppo is like, you got all these big Chinese brands, and they all have sub brands, right?
Right.
And like Huawei has Honor, and Oppo has like this Realme, and Xiaomi has like
Redmi and CC and Pocophone.
Right, and so they all have these sub brands, which like I think they're kind of trying to disassociate themselves from these bigger brands, so that it doesn't feel like, oh, it's like Facebook owning Instagram and WhatsApp, right? A lot of people still don't realize that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook or Instagram is owned by Facebook, and so it feels like they're separate, but they're all owned by this massive corporation in the background.
Yeah, and then there's BBK Group, which is, Oppo, Vivo, OnePlus.
Right, but
Realme.
So, I mean, BBK basically controls everything, the supply chain, and they are the innovation makers, right? And they are giving these brands the kind of supply chain scale to like quickly push out new innovations and then quickly reduce the prices on the components, right? In a way that LG and Samsung cannot keep up with. And so I can only see these brands getting more popular over time, especially, in emerging markets, like India there are tons of people there, and they're all looking for their next big thing, and they're basically growing their brands there very quickly.
But I look at this phone and I'm like, okay, this is great. The price is good, but the price isn't great. Like for India, this is a very expensive phone. And, you compare it to say like the K20 Pro last year from Redmi, right? That was a Snapdragon 855 with a triple rear camera, like tele, ultra wide, regular, for $300. Now it didn't have 5G, granted, and it was last year's spec, but like to me, if this phone had been $450 with 5G, like this particular X50 Pro, I'd been like, oh wow, okay, this is interesting. But like $650 is what it translates to right now. That's getting into almost normal flagship territory for me. So I don't know.
Right.
Like for India, I think this is a tough sell, but who knows? Maybe it'll fly. We'll see. Anyway, we should probably wrap up. I know there's a couple of other topics on the list, but I'm going to leave them for next week.
Okay.
Do you want to tell the audience where they can find you on the internet, your various social media handles, and of course, where they can read you?
Sure. On Twitter, you can find me at Ray Wongy. That's RAYWONG with a Y. And then I guess on Instagram at Sour Lemons.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, I can't seem to get like a consistent branding username across all my social, but I am very happy that I got the Byte account at Raymond. So nice. So I mean, I haven't posted a Byte in a while, but if you guys also want to find me on Byte, it's just at Raymond. So sweet. Yeah, you can find me on there, and I guess just hanging around on Input,
Yeah, absolutely. So check out Ray's work. I've got a few links to his stuff, especially the Galaxy S20 Ultra camera comparison in the show notes. So please look at that. And you folks know where to find me. I'm at ThinkGirl on Twitter and Instagram. That's TNKGRL, like the comic book character, but without the vowels. That's how you'll remember. Twitter is where you want to interact with me about this podcast. If you want to ask me questions, correct us on that F of 1.4 and all that, do it in Twitter. And then if you want to look at pretty pictures taken with phones or pretty pictures of phones, also sometimes of phones taken in phones, that's like very meta there. Check out my Instagram. There's also a YouTube channel, Mobile Tech Podcast is what it's called, where you'll find hands-ons like the LG V60 ThinQ 5G. That's a handful, mouthful, of a name. But you'll find a video hands-on of that there. So youtube.com/Mobile Tech Podcast. Basically visual compliments to the show. And of course, the show lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. So check it out. If you subscribe for the first time, or rather listen for the first time, and you want to subscribe, go to mobiletechpodcast.com. There's links to subscribe with Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, a few other things. And there's an old school RSS feed there too, if you like to use that for subscribing to shows. Please rate the show and review the show on those platforms that support it. We appreciate that. So that's it. And now I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a VPN service that makes online privacy protection easy and attainable. Surfshark encrypts all internet traffic sent to and from your devices and ensures that your IP address remains hidden to make sure nobody can see what you do online. On top of that, they block ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts. And unlike other VPN services, you can use it on as many devices as you'd like simultaneously. I use it when I travel to protect my privacy when I'm on open Wi-Fi hotspots. And say I want to access Netflix US when I'm in the UK. I can do that with Surfshark VPN. Another example is the other way around. Say that I'd like to see a UK show on Netflix, but I'm in the US. Well, Surfshark VPN lets me do that. So that's how I've used Surfshark VPN, both while traveling and when at home. And now I'd like to share the love. I want you to try out Surfshark for yourself with my exclusive limited time deal. Click on the description below or go to surfshark.deals/mobiletechpodcast. That's surfshark.deals/mobiletechpodcast. Thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring the show. Thanks, Ray, for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll have you back again sometime, maybe to discuss how to make proper use of camera phones on video and photos.
I love it.
Yeah, so stay tuned, folks. We'll have another show next week. And until then, cheers, everybody.
See ya.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with ThinQ, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.